everybody, to our latest installment of the Cops and Convicts podcast. My name is Sean Shepard. I'm your host, and I am here with someone I've known for multiple years. Now, Alfonso, I want you to tell me how to correctly pronounce your last name.
That's Escare.
Esquer. So I've never pronounced it correctly. Our special guest today is Alfonso Esquer. Alfonso has spent much of his professional career in law enforcement on the local and the federal level. And he also spent 8 years in our armed services. So, Alfonso, I want to welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, just as a reminder to everyone watching, please hit that subscription bell and subscribe to our podcast. Hit the like button so that all the algorithm stuff will allow our channel to expand. So, Alfonso, let's start with, what was your life like that led you into joining the Marines, correct?
That's correct, Marine Corps.
So talk to me about what life was like for you before that point.
So I grew up in Long Beach, California, and throughout different cities in Los Angeles. And I would say I grew up with my parents in the house, but not necessarily present in the house or not that active in my life. They were providing me a good lifestyle in ways of they worked very hard, but I was kind of on my own with an older sibling who's 3 years older than me. And so she and I were kind of left to just find our ways in the city of LA on our own. So growing up, it was really just about partying and, just kind of living a wild life from a young age. It wasn't until around age 18 when I finally decided to get into the Marine Corps, which brought some structure that I was lacking.
So did you have a sense of self-awareness, knowing that you needed some structure, or did some things happen while you were in your teens that really pointed to you joining the military?
Sure. So to get on a little bit more personal level, so from birth to around 18, I just pretty much lived according to my influences and those around me. I did end up connecting to a group of young people that were not necessarily doing the best of things in life. And around 18, I had a personal encounter with God, and that really changed my perspective of life. And I realized that I needed something more, and it really gave me a hope that there was a lot more to life than what I had previously been living. And so that kind of changed my direction and my perspectives. And around that time frame as well, I met kind of like my high school sweetheart, and we had a child at a young age. So we were both around 19 years old when our first son came to be born. His name is Christian. And knowing that I needed to be a provider and be able to provide a stable home, I joined the Marine Corps because that allowed me to have a stable income and housing, and also to be able to care for our son.
Can you share a little bit with our viewers what that personal experience with God was like? What happened to you that really sounds like it changed the course of your life?
Sure. So that personal encounter really got me to reflect deeply inside of myself. I had been carrying a lot of issues of abandonment, rejection. Just felt that those that were my parents in the household, that though they were providing a good household for us, or at least they provided our basic needs and all of that stuff, I didn't necessarily have a father figure, somebody that would guide me. I don't ever remember hearing "I love you" or "Good job, son." I was an athlete from as long as I could remember. I joined martial arts when I was about 6 years old and was really involved in that. And so it really took my athletics seriously and started playing baseball and soccer. And when I got into high school, I played football and maintained martial arts. And so in my experience, I didn't have the father sitting on the sideline or really even the mother, and not in any way speaking negatively about them, but they were really living out the life that they had known. Now that I'm older, I've talked to them about this, and they pretty much had the same cycle of parenting where they didn't have the parents that were there really to support them in their needs. So I would look to the sideline, and a lot of my friends had their parents there, and I just never had that. So I had to find it with my friends, or my sister was really my partner, almost like a mother figure because she was a little older than me. And so when I came to have an experience in a personal encounter with God, um, it's it's as if God became that father figure for me, and He began to show me who I was. And so the deceptions that I had believed about myself, that I was rejected, or maybe that I wasn't any good, or that I wouldn't amount to anything, really began to change. And so my perspectives of myself began to change by what I began to read in His Word. And the Word really began to let me know who I really was, because I believed that He was really my creator, and that He accepted me back into a family and into sonship, that He called me His son. And so I took that literally because I was crying out as a young person, really needing that father. And so God took that role, and I truly believed it. So that really brought change to me. And number one, it changed my perspective of myself, like I've mentioned. And so I began to really live out my life from that point, and what He said about me. So God, if you've read the Word, it talks about how I'm truly loved, and that's something that I felt I lacked. I didn't understand love in those days. I felt that love was something that was more of us in selfish in nature, as in what you could give me and what you could provide for me, or what you could, if you're there, then I'm loved. But if you're not there, then the love leaves, or my value kind of disseminates or goes away. But I learned that God never goes away, and so that became really my foundation, to where I began to build my life upon the foundation of the solid, never changing rock of the Word of God. And so my life began to change instantly from there, because I really understood that He was there for me. He would never reject me or leave me. And from there, I could build a firm foundation. And that's what began to happen for me.
So, was there a single incident that made you move in God's direction, or was there someone that introduced you to the Word of God? How did you get to God?
So in my household, my parents were kind of like at their wits' end. They were, from what I hear now, they were very close to divorcing and moving apart from each other. And it seemed like just everything was going wrong in this one season of life. And that was when I was in my young adult years. I was 17, coming into my 18th birthday. And it was also it was May 5th of 1992. And if you remember that historical date, it's when the Rodney King incident occurred. I remember watching it just so lively, right in front of my face. I was watching on the news. I still lived, or I was living in LA, and watching it on the news, and then now hearing the destruction that's going on outside, and looking out my window and seeing burning buildings and all kinds of things going on outside, just the city in chaos. And that really hit home for me, that there's a lot of hurting people out there, that there's a lot of injustice going on, and people take that injustice personally. And I was feeling like that as well, as in I lacked any type of love or any type of stability. And so I was invited to a retreat. It was a Christian retreat at the Shrine Auditorium right across from USC. And I attended this thing really just to just to say that I went. I didn't go there expecting anything, because I had previously not known God, or not known uh, of Him in an intimate way. I knew of Him by knowledge, as in I had heard that there's a God, but I didn't know Him personally. And so when I went to this retreat, and I saw a a play, it was a mime. There were not even any words spoken in this thing, but it really had an impact in my life. And I dropped to my knees and I started crying. And it felt like as if all the weight that I had been carrying for so many years had just been released from me instantly. And leaving the Shrine Auditorium, nothing changed on the outside. The buildings were still burning. There were still people running around in chaos, a lot of looting going on. And I had even, before I went into the Shrine Auditorium for that retreat, I had even planned, hey, let's go do this retreat, and after we'll go get some stuff from some of these stores, is what I was thinking in my mind. I was going to tell my sister, let's go do this. That's where I was at in that time.
So you were going to loot.
I was going to go loot, because that was my mentality at the time. It really didn't have any clear direction or guidance.
So you just got done having this spiritual experience, dropping on your knees, crying, and after that, you're like, "Let's go loot."
No, that was my thought before I went into the auditorium.
Okay.
And when I
Right.
left the auditorium, it's like as my mind and my mentality had changed. I no longer had that desire to go do that. I actually had a compassion for people that were out there looting, and I didn't get involved. I was brand new. I had, what they had told me in the retreat was that I was born again, that I was made new, that
Mm.
all the things of my past had been forgotten, and that I left them there. And so when I left, I came out feeling and knowing that I was brand new. And so, uh, being so young, I mean, just what I'm saying is young in my new experience, my new found relationship in God, is that my desires had changed, and I no longer wanted to go do that. And that was instant. It was a miracle that I could barely explain in human language, but it was something that I just knew that I was different. And from there, I jumped right into it. I mean, I went full force. I started to read the Word of God, and I started to learn about myself and who He says that I am. And from there on out, I started to learn more and just try to connect with others that had this information, because it was as if I had found a treasure, a hidden treasure, and I was willing to leave everything that I had previously known before, including all of my hurt and rejection and abandonment and all of the mistakes and wrongs that I had done in my past. I felt that I had become somebody new, and I was willing to leave all of that stuff behind. But from what I heard, the good news. And now I found this treasure, and I was willing to go and just dive headfirst into it. And so I immediately got connected to a local church, and I was fortunate enough to connect with somebody that I could relate to. It was in those days, 1992. I'm not sure if you remember, but it was around the time frame where G Funk and this kind of like singing rap style, R&B style of music was out. And so I connected with a music ministry that was singing this type of music or performing this type of music out in different locations, different churches, but also secular events like lowrider shows here in LA, and different nightclubs, and really just I jumped in head first. And so I moved in with them because I was at that age where I was ready to go. So at 17, I moved into this home with these ministers that were going out and sharing this good news, and I wanted to be all about it because I knew that this was something that was really going to make a difference in my life, and I loved what I was hearing, what as they would teach me. And so we began to travel throughout the United States, and as they would sing, I'm not a musician myself, but I wanted to get out there and share what I had found. And so in between songs, I would get up there and grab the mic and just give a quick testimony of what God had done for me. And so in my young years, straight out of the gate, I began to really serve the Lord in whatever capacity or whatever knowledge I had. I just began to give back. I felt that that was my obligation because so much weight had been lifted from me. And so I felt I wanted to go and help others in any which way that I could.
So you're a born again Christian and you join the military and you see 4 years of combat service in the military. Um, but by this time, you have this sense of compassion about you because you did just mention that when you came out of the shrine at USC, you had compassion for the people that were out in the streets looting, which I'm sure a lot of our viewers that are familiar with members of law enforcement and those that back the blue um, really would find it eye opening to hear that a police officer would have compassion for people who were out breaking the law here in the United States. So before you went into law enforcement, you're with the military. That's a different type of law enforcement. You take this born again Christian mentality with you, or I shouldn't even call it a mentality. It's who you are, and you enter the military with this sense of God, Christ, and compassion and love for others. How what was your experience like in the military, being who you were? And I'm assuming that you were around a lot of people who were not like you in the military as it relates to God. Share that experience being kind of a fish out of water in a lot of different instances, and you have a weapon that the federal government is expecting you to use.
Yes, exactly. It was a very difficult situation coming in. immediately from our first training boot camp there in San Diego. Immediately, you're told you're going to lose your identity there, as in we're going to crush you down to the ground and rebuild you up as a killer, as a United States Marine. That you're the number one killing weapon. And I mean, I can say that Marine Corps has outstanding training for that purpose. That's why the Marine Corps is really America's watchdog. It's the one military branch that the president could access without having to get congressional approval, and access and deploy within 24 hours
As
anywhere
opposed to
in the
any
world.
of the other branches. It's
The
the
other branches
Marines.
require a a uh, a declared state of war to activate them for deployment to go to any foreign ground. The Marine Corps remains out on the oceans 24/7 at all times, and that's why it's has the name of America's first fighting force, first to hit the ground, because Marines are on ship, and because the Marine Corps is a part of the Department of the Navy. They are out there on ship, and so anywhere they could strategically, they're placed around every ocean throughout the earth, and they could hit the ground anywhere needed within a day's time, and they're able to be fully self-sustained to hold whatever combat mission that's required. So going through boot camp, I was told this almost a sense of uh, renewing of my mind of everything that I had brought with me into boot camp. I was required to leave it there at the door, and the Marine Corps really has a way of crushing you down through their disciplining, and then raising you up now to become a fully structured and disciplined killing machine. And so that was difficult to grasp. One example of that is they teach you how to walk in cadence or how to march in cadence. And if you've ever seen it, it's very impressive because the first day they march you down to throughout the entire base, and we're all marching in a what they call a gaggle, as in all out of sequence. There's no kind of synchronous march whatsoever. We're coming in untrained and undisciplined. By the second month you're there, it's a total of about 4 months long of training without any breaks or without leaving. So you're really there to focus on your training. By the time you graduate, you are walking in absolute synchronous mode with all of your peers, all of the Marines that are with you, and so it's just something impressive to see because there's a snap and a click and a pop to every step that you take, and on command, there's one drill instructor who's marching you to wherever you need to get, and he calls a command, and you have now gained the discipline that you need to be able to make a move instantly, and that's really goes to the type of training that the training that you're gonna require to be able to go to combat. So if somebody that has a higher rank than you gives a command, you want to be able to instantly respond and not question it, not think about it, and not allow fear to take over, but you instantly respond. And that's why we see so many heroic actions by so many of our different Marines and soldiers out there in the world.
So you go through this basic training that is designed to break you down as a person, receive an indoctrination to build you back up to be a member of what they term the world's greatest killing machine. Talk to me about the mental aspect of being a Marine, being a combat veteran. I'm not going to ask you any of the things that you were required to do as a Marine, but I know that there's some things that you have done that have left you changed, or things that you've seen that have left you changed. Talk to me about how the Marine Corps experience changed you psychologically.
Yeah, so they crush you and they build you back up with the mentality that you are fully disciplined and ready to follow instruction given instantly. You're also taught that mission accomplishment first before anything else. As in, you're given a mission, you are to accomplish it no matter what. That may even require your life or the lives of fellow Marines. As in, if you're given a position, hold down this bridge because it's vital for the enemy that may come across. You're going to hold it down, and you may be overrun, but because of your discipline and the training, and because you believe in the overall function of what you're there for, you hold it down, and that's where it may come into some very dangerous situations. But being able to live that out in life, and with the values that I had just maybe years before that now acquired, it was a very difficult circumstance or situation to be in, because now I'm being required to take somebody's life if given that order, or if put in the right situation. And so I found myself having to harden my heart, because my heart was now uh, seeking the new life that I had, that had been following. And so, and now when I'm faced with these situations, and in possibly now having to commit harm or just perform in violent situations, I had to harden my heart to be able to get through it, so that I wouldn't break down emotionally and mentally. And so that began to really break down my personal relationship with God.
I was going to ask you, a man can't serve two masters. I was going to ask you how you were able to serve your country through the Marines and serve God at the same time. And I'm hearing you say that you had to set God aside for a while.
That's correct.
How traumatic was that for you? Because it's not something that happened overnight. This is a sequence of events that lead you to a decision that you have to make, and you made that decision. Um, was that something that you carried with you each day, or were you able to more or less set God aside and be a Marine 100% of the time?
So just like you said, you can't serve two masters, and so it was easier to follow the crowd, or follow my peers. One thing about the Marine Corps and law enforcement that we could touch upon and hear in a little bit is that you build this camaraderie that is unlike any other. The closest thing that I could describe it to, or try to bring some context to it, is athletics. If you've been in any form of organized sports, when you go through difficult times together, whether you lose or you win, you do it together as a team. And the discipline that it takes to be able to get good at your skill of whatever athletic game you're playing, when you go through difficult times together, it builds this bonding that's like no other. So in the Marine Corps, we went through some very difficult times, and to the point to where I would trust the person next to me with my life. And so you grow in what's in a sense of brotherhood, as in I trusted the person next to me, regardless of their race or their gender or where they came from. You learn to trust them. And so what they do then becomes kind of a part of then my nature, and I began to do what they do. And so there's a hidden theme inside of the Marine Corps that we're the biggest drinkers gun club. And so really we're outstanding marksmen with our weapons, but we also party really hard at the end of the day. And I've now, looking at it from a more reflective position, I look at it as in that helped to really numb myself from what I was feeling inside. Mentally, I was not right, because I was doing things that I didn't truly believe in. And so the alcohol was a way to cope with those hurts. And so I began to really get into to numbing myself, and I started to drink quite a bit of alcohol and with my peers. It was almost as a something that you had to do. Really, it was part of the culture to really just get engaged in numbing yourself, and really just enjoying what I thought was enjoying myself at the time with my peers. And so when we'd be deployed, we'd be out for months, out in either some foreign place, or out in the jungle or wilderness or desert somewhere. And you really learn to really become attached to the fellow soldier next to you. And so that's where my relationship with God, as much as I had grown to love him and understand his love for me, that got put on the shelf. And I began to love my brothers, and now my my new distraction, which was really alcohol and anything that I could to really numb the way that I was feeling inside.
I'm glad you said anything that you could, because you and I have some similarities in our upbringing. My father was a combat veteran in Vietnam, And he shared something with me because my father became an alcoholic when he got out of the military. And alcoholism is what ultimately led to his liver cancer and his death. But he said to me, when we were over there, he said, we did every drug under the sun while we were there. And when I got discharged from the Army, I didn't have access to those drugs anymore. But I did have access to a legal drug, and it was alcohol. And so I did that and continued to do that and abused that. So I'm guessing, and you correct me if I'm wrong, there were a number of experiences that you and your fellow Marines went through together, and you shared that trauma together, and you developed similar coping skills that you participated in together, right? And I'm hearing you say that it wasn't healthy.
That's right.
Taking substances to deal with your reality, like you said, numbing, wasn't a healthy way to deal with things. But you survived the military. You survived your 4 years of combat service, and then you did another 4 years in what capacity?
So after my 4 years, then I was at the point where I could either be discharged and go on to find employment somewhere else. But by that point, my wife and I, we had our second child, and so trying to think about what would be in the best interest of our family overall. And I knew at that point I started to acquire some desires to get into law enforcement. The Marine Corps is favorable. I mean, very favorable over law enforcement. Many military members go into law enforcement. But I knew I wasn't ready at that time. I had already started on the path of getting my education, so I was very close. Actually, I was done with my bachelor's degree, so I had received a bachelor's degree from Biola University, and that was in psychology and some biblical studies. But at that point, at my 4 year mark, when I was ready to either be discharged or do another 4 years, I decided the best thing for our overall family and to continue my education, because they have really great benefits for military members to receive their education. I went on to get my master's degree while I was in the Marine Corps, which was fully funded by the Marine Corps, which I'm very grateful for. And so I got a master's then. That's where I began to study criminal justice and become really interested in criminal justice. And so I was really preparing for my career what was truly my goal. Now, after going to serve 8 years in the Marine Corps, I was going to get into law enforcement. And so I knew that I wanted to do something that at the highest level of investigation. So I considered either joining the FBI or the DEA. And so I lateral moved from a combat unit now into a more intelligence-based unit, which was weapons of mass destruction. At the time, it was Iraq was getting really hot, and so I knew I wanted to make myself marketable. I felt that that was going to be something that the federal government was going to want, or something that was going to put me above others if I had some type of occupational skill in what they were really looking at. So my job specialty became nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons specialist. So, but that also made me very marketable for Iraq, because that's the reason that we went over there
Right.
with accusations of the WMDs and such. So I was there on the front line, ready to. First of all, I had to train all the Marines getting ready to go. So I was very active and involved with our deployment over to Iraq, and so that was what I did for the next 4 years.
So you did that for 4 years, and then you embark upon a 12-year career, still inside the federal government, with the Drug Enforcement Agency. Take me through that process of getting out of the Marines and wanting to be a DEA agent.
So in my deployments, I was able to connect with several federal agents that were doing their time abroad, and I really got to hear the ins and outs. And it sounded just like what we were doing in the Marine Corps, but on a higher scale and domestic. And so that interested me. And so I went ahead and applied for both the FBI and the DEA, and I said, whichever takes me first, I'll go with either or. So I was in the hiring process for both agencies, and the DEA at the time appealed to me a little more because it was they were using the same type of tactics, military-based tactics that I had become so familiar with and was trained well with in the Marine Corps, and I felt comfortable under those situations. And that's a whole nother situation. What I had experienced in my 8 years in the Marine Corps was a lot of traumatic time, but I felt comfortable in it, and so I wanted.
Comfortable during traumatic instances.
Yes, it may sound a little peculiar that you could feel comfortable in that, but it's again a way of coping with the trauma. It's a dangerous place to be when you could feel when trauma feels normal, and so I felt that the DEA would allow me to still function in that high adrenaline uh, state of what I knew to be trauma, but I felt that I had it under control, as in I don't know another term, but gung ho. I wanted to go out there and perform what I was doing in the Marine Corps, but now domestically. And I had a good heart to do it, as in I had no, there was no, there was no injustice in my heart. I wanted to go out there and go and help out my community and do my best in ridding our countries and community of dangerous drugs and that type of thing. At least that's how I began. With that was the perception I began my career into the DEA. But I learned that as then I began my career in DEA, and we'll get a little bit more into this. That I still had that trauma with me, and I was carrying it. So I just carried it from one agency to the next, and in a way, I could say that it would give me the motivation or the drive to do well at my work, in the sense of good results in the cases that I made, but it wasn't the best in the interest of our communities.
So talk to me. Talk to me, Alfonso. Summarize for me what you feel the role or the major purpose of the DEA is. What what are they supposed to be doing?
So the DEA enforces the U.S. drug laws of the United States. So it operates under the Department of Justice, with its most immediate supervisor, or with the boss being the United States Attorney General, and then the Department of Justice, and the DEA is a department under the Department of Justice. So our mission really was to combat the most some of the biggest cartel and kingpins out there that are trafficking in drugs internationally and domestic. The ones that are either importing or manufacturing, transporting uh, dangerous drugs into the United States. So I found myself being able to travel abroad quite a bit in pursuit of investigations that would lead back to the United States. So under the jurisdiction that we have in the United States, in partnership with other countries, we're able to go out to wherever the origination is of those drugs that are, if they're planned to come into the United States, then we're able to go there and take our investigations there and partner with the law enforcement agencies that are on foreign soil. And so I found myself very often going to Mexico and South America and such, where most of the dangerous drugs that reach the homeland here in the United States, uh, that's where they originate from, and they find their way here. So many of my investigations started off in different countries, and so that's where I would go to investigate those things. And I found myself the majority of time uh, around the U.S. border and Mexico, because the majority of drugs that were coming in during my time frame in those 12 years were coming in through Mexico. And also being Latino and speaking Spanish, I was one of the key players in a lot of our investigations. Really found myself on the front line, uh, infiltrating into cartel activity, and really trying to stop the drugs from coming into the country.
So looking back and knowing what you know about present day United States, the DEA appears to be failing miserably at their job because there's not a shortage of drugs in this country at all. You can find any drug that you want in this country probably within a matter of 15 minutes.
That's correct. And we were really operating off of the legislation that had been laid out in policy and law since the 80s, where we declared war on drugs, this supposed war on drugs. And in that time frame where this war was declared, um, ridding our country of drugs, or at least uh, creating a new agency that would focus on drugs, which the DEA was before that was called the Bureau of Dangerous Drugs and Narcotics. Then it was restructured, and it was given the name of the Drug Enforcement Administration um, during that time frame where we declared war on drugs. And our mission was to go out and infiltrate these major drug kingpins that were bringing drugs into the country. And as you said, the war has failed miserably. And in my time frame and in my perspective, uh, the war failed, but even at a greater expense, in that the amount of people now incarcerated is way beyond what I believe was even intended in the beginning. Where we're housing more than 2 million people in prison, and with that comes many repercussions, as in families that are being broken, and just the cycle of that cycle of broken family, just a continuation of broken families. From, you take the father out of the household. It kind of reminded me of the household that I came from, as in not having the guidance that I required. So I'm thinking, what about the families that I'm breaking apart based on this drug war? We had a funny internal joke. It's not very funny at all, but it was a internal joke, as in, we're only catching about 10% of what's really coming into the country, and we knew it. But we learned the art of articulation, of being able to articulate or justify our reason of existence for the DEA. We knew that many drugs were coming in unseized and untouched, but we needed to be able to paint the picture that we were making an effective change within our communities, but knowing that we were not really even brushing the surface. There were so many drugs coming in. The inside joke was, if you could trip over drugs just leaving your front door or out in the parking lot. There's so many drugs coming in that they're all over the place, and we're not catching them. So we often saw or investigated commercial trucks coming in with drugs, and we knew that we would seize one truckload and we would all celebrate because maybe we got 1,000 kilos of some form of dangerous drug, cocaine or heroin, whatever it was. But 3 or 4 followed right behind them. And so we knew these statistics, and so we continued to go along with the mission. And we would often say, you'd often hear in the agency, it's kind of like smoke and mirrors. We're not really making an impact the way that we should.
So this is fascinating. You spend 12 years inside the DEA, and then you become a member of the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department, right? With this background as a Latino male in drug enforcement and in the military as a killing machine. Now, when I think Maricopa County, I think of Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
That's who deputized me.
Personally.
And I will say a quote: when he gave me my credentials and badge, I was cross-designated from a federal agent to also being able to enforce the local county laws and penal code there. But when I raised my right hand to become cross-deputized and designated as the sheriff, he said, "We need all the guns out there on the streets to get these bastards." And during that time, there was also a big change in legislation or in the local laws there to allow local law enforcement to enforce immigration laws. As in, local law enforcement, actually only federal agents are able to enforce immigration laws, because that's what that's the agency has created. It's under Homeland Security. Now it's Homeland Security. Before it was ICE and Customs and Border Protection. But now local law enforcement were able to pull over anybody that they considered to be somebody that was illegal in the country. And so he wanted to expand his reach by bringing in all the federal agents that were working in other agencies to be able to enforce or to help with the change in those laws, to be able to get the immigrants out of here.
So when he said we need all the guns in the streets to get these bastards, what bastards was he referring to, in your estimation?
In my estimation, it was the immigration problem. It was his answer to being able to assist with the immigration problem, and that was immigration related to coming into the Arizona. I was in the state of Arizona at that time,
Right.
but California and Arizona were and Texas are the highest, have the highest rate of immigration, or those that he was referring to as in people that were coming into the country illegally. That's what he wanted to combat, and so that's why he deputized federal agents.
So to me, that sounds like a blatant policy of racial profiling. Because in his mind, what does an illegal person look like? What does an illegal person look like to him? That person looks like you.
Exactly.
It doesn't look like him.
That's correct.
How did you feel about taking a job in an agency like that, where you knew that that was a big part of your responsibility as a member of law enforcement?
So I'm glad that we were able to establish the context with the Marine Corps first, because I first mentioned that in the Marine Corps you build this camaraderie and this brotherhood, and that same brotherhood I found as well in law enforcement, where because I was so close to the men and women that were next to me, it's almost as if you perform the same functions as what they're performing, and so
Right.
um, there's many great law enforcement people out there doing great work. But in law enforcement, there's that brotherhood where you don't overstep your partners.
Don't worry about it.
You don't do anything that is going to contradict their behaviors. If I could just bring up one quick theory, just to give a little bit more context to it on the internals, I think it's important that we bring even more context on the inside of law enforcement, and much of it came from my learning in the military. But if we could just give a very basic definition of racism, it we could say that it's the beliefs, our personal beliefs, and they're based on our beliefs in our personal race, or a race that is superior to another.
Yep.
So the context that I want to bring into it is that if we look at it from that way, from that perspective, that a belief in one's race that may be superior to another, I kind of attribute it to the race, or if we want to look at it from a belief system rather than the color of skin, but we could tie them together, a belief system, and then the color of law enforcement would be blue. So the race of law enforcement may be blue, and that stands at times above, or it's stronger than even the race that one themselves may hold.
That's deep.
And so if you're functioning under the race of blue, then you're going to back and support your peers regardless of what happens. And the perspective is that the color blue, or the race of blue, is superior to any other race. And so my evidence of that is the recent Tyree Williams,
Tyree Nichols.
I'm sorry, Tyree Nichols, the violence that was imposed on him, and coming from 5 black officers on one black member of the community. So we see a black on black violence happening there. And so I have to ponder that and think, how could that happen? We seek to bring in more people of color into law enforcement to help mitigate those problems, and to kind of break up some of the barriers that we're seeing, where we're seeing a lot of white police officers imposing violence over people of color. Another situation is gray.
Freddie
Gray,
Gray in
where there
in
was
Baltimore.
in Baltimore, where there were 3 black officers that were a part of that scenario as well. And so I have to think back to my personal experience and and reflect back on when I was functioning under the color blue. There were many times, or the majority of time, I would say, because I was on the front of Mexico and the U.S. border, the majority of those that were bringing illegal drugs into the country were Latinos like myself, and we share the same color skin. And being one of the only persons of color in my enforcement group, there was a lot of talk about the perspective that they saw those that were committing crimes, or that we suspected of committing crimes. So before we ever stepped our foot out of the office to go conduct our investigations or perform any type of enforcement, there was a lot of talk. So before you do any type of enforcement or investigation or surveillance or engage a person, there has to be some type of operational plan. What is it that you're going to do? And you have to really uh, come up with a plan that's going to be safe for all the members of law enforcement, and what is the overall mission, and then that has to be approved by a supervisor. But before we even left the door, there was all kinds of talk that insinuated that our suspects were bad people, or were as if already convicted and found guilty. So we would leave the front door with this perspective, as in if this is the enemy, and we're just doing the right thing to fight the enemy. I share that because it gives a deeper perspective and context of how at times, at least I could speak for myself, the way that law enforcement goes out into the communities and performs their job. It's you jump in your car and then you begin to conduct your regular operations or business of duty, and you're leaving with this perspective that it's us against them. It's blue against whatever persons that we come across. Um, and yesterday I was reviewing Tyree Nichols, the footage of that incident, and because now there's a lot more of the the body camera footage, you could hear the officers talking, and it brought me back, and it really kind of triggered some emotions within me, because the talk that they were having. One specific example I'll give is they had pulled Tyree over, and the reason they pulled him over was reckless driving, or at least that's what they say. And they began to attempt to restrain him. They pepper sprayed him as well as tased him, and he was able to get away because he was in fear of his life. You're being attacked by 5 people that are a lot bigger than you, and Tyree was really fighting for his life, so he ran and he got away. But the camera was still running when now the officers are trying to regroup and compose themselves, and they're saying, "I can't wait to find that guy. We need to stomp him." And I heard that clearly, and it's on video. So at this point, if you put yourself in their shoes, let's say they see the reckless driver. They have maybe they know, or maybe they don't know who's in the vehicle, but they're pulling over a person for reckless driving. So that's a very minor incident. That's a traffic citation, if anything. Then they go to restrain him, and we know where that leads from the video. So now you have a male who's on the run, and I think anybody logically speaking could consider that he ran because he was in fear of his life, or maybe he just didn't want to get caught. But whatever the reason is, the perspective that was left there with those officers where they wanted to stomp him, meaning they took it personally. They were angry, and they really wanted to find him, and for the purposes that were shared in that video were to hurt him, not necessarily to bring him to justice, but at least from the mouths of what was heard, or the voices that were heard on that video, was let's get him and let's stomp him. And then we know what happens next is they did eventually find him, and they did do exactly that. So if you put yourself in those shoes, as if you're the one now looking for this person who possibly the officers could have taken as they were humiliated, or they were really upset, angry. I mean, it was obvious in the videos that they were angry. So they finally catch him, and they already have the intent in their heart to harm him because he ran away. And here's a man who's in reality still innocent, right? Innocent until proven guilty. He had the only thing that he was being suspected of at that time was reckless driving, but now that's put aside. Really, the initial reason why they wanted to stop him was for reckless driving, but now it becomes something personal, and they chase after him, and they did end up stomping him all the way till death.
So to the crowd that believes that Tyree Nichols should have just complied, Ashley Babbitt should have just complied. If Tyree Nichols complies, he wouldn't have lost his life. And we've had a number of officers in our game changer training sessions of color take great offense to that logic, because if everyone was just complying in life, there'd be no need for law enforcement. You wouldn't speed. There would be no rolling stop signs, right? That's not complying. So what is your mentality, Alfonso, when it comes to people who say, well, he didn't comply, now he's dead. I guess he deserves to be dead because he didn't comply. How do you feel about that?
Well, one, it's a deep injustice to have that type of perspective. And first of all, when the mission of police in general, and you could Google or you could look on any website of any police department really in the United States, and it'll say within their mission statement, it'll say somewhere in there is to protect and to serve. So when officers begin to take matters personally and they begin to abuse power with the perspective that you need to comply to me because I hold the power and you don't, that's where I see an injustice. When their initial mission statement is to protect the community, not to harm them, not to force anybody to comply. So in the case of Nichols, he was, according to the video that we see, and anybody that watches it, it'd be very, very difficult to say anything other. But the fact that, well, first I saw compliance in there, but the fact that he was being, great violence was being brought to him.
He was being
and almost immediately.
He's being mauled.
He was being mauled, and great violence was being brought to him, and he was pepper sprayed. And if you've ever had pepper spray, it feels like if you're suffocating and you cannot breathe. It takes away your eyesight if it gets in your eyes. You can't breathe. You really are in a state of panic just to get oxygen. So your body is moving in ways that are almost out of control to yourself. You want to get out of pain. You want to get out of this burning sensation. It feels like your lungs are just, you're not able to inhale or exhale. So I can understand his body movements and such. But when you're being mauled, as you say, it seems natural that anybody that gets taken over or gets attacked in such a way, your first instinct is to get away, just to get free. I don't see where somebody could comply under that type of situation, as well as being tased. If you've been tased in law enforcement, if you're whatever weapon you're going to deploy that is anti-lethal,
you have to experience
you need to experience it yourself. So
right.
I've been both pepper sprayed and tased, and they tasing feels like if you're going to almost as if you're going to explode, as in there's no way of really regaining your natural functions. You're just in a state of complete emergency and shock. Every form of adrenaline and anything that's within you is in a state of complete emergency. You just want to get away no matter what you do. But going back to the whole compliance ideas, that I believe is coming from a wrongful perspective. Anybody that would think that is the correct way to protect and serve, that definitely cannot be the right way in any way. Comply because I hold power and you don't is a wrongful perspective in which to see good policing, or it's almost in the sense as if you don't comply, then I'm going to hurt you. And I'm not sure why that would be the perspective that anybody would want to take.
Yeah, and I haven't heard anyone really break it down like that. If you don't comply, I'm going to hurt you. It's not necessarily something that's said, but it's a mentality. And you and I have been friendly and acquainted with one another for a number of years now. And I want to talk to you. I want you to talk to me and our viewers, which, by the way, I want to remind our viewers to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button if you like this content. Um, we're here with Alfonso Esker, who has had a career in the Marines, the DEA, and local law enforcement. Talk to me about the culture inside of law enforcement. You broke down the culture of blue and defined a different type of racism that I've never heard before. Explain the culture inside of law enforcement that would allow that profession to go from being racist and only allowing white males to be employed in that profession. Going from that extreme, where black and brown and female were not allowed in that profession, all the way up to Tyree Nichols, where you have 5 black officers beating the life out of a black citizen. Talk to me about that culture. What's wrong inside of that culture?
So I feel like I want to speak a little bit deeper into it than, again, just scratching the surface, because we have,
You have the floor,
a whole
man.
lot of jargon out there that talks to us about increased training and exposing law enforcement to more resources, as in mental health officers, to assist in enforcement activity. And those are all great tools. But I feel unless there's going to be some real change, we need to go a little deeper. And that really looks at the heart of mankind in general. Now, I'm going to use the word that may sound offensive, but I'll give some context to the way that I use the word, is in the corruption of the heart. And I don't mean corruption in the sense that I've ever been exposed to anybody that did corruption blatantly, as in steal something or plant evidence or anything corrupt in those ways. But there is a form of corruption of the heart where we begin to take matters personally and even function in our careers in law enforcement for self-gain. And anytime things are done for self rather than for others, there could be a sense of corruption in there. It's we're doing it for the purposes of our own self attributes or whatever, or our own self achievement, or whatever we could gain from somebody else's loss. And so when I say the heart can become corrupt, I first reflect to myself, because I take responsibility and now accountability for even my own actions when I was in law enforcement, and knowing that my heart had become calloused to those that I was supposed to be serving. But my heart had become hardened in the sense that I was no longer thinking about the service of others, which is unselfish, but more along the lines of a selfish gain. I'll give you an example. For instance, in this case, where if I was making good cases, I was motivated to make good cases and make as many arrests as I could, take down kingpins at whatever the cost to get to them. Nobody comes to a kingpin level. Like we know the notorious Chapo Guzman, who was considered a kingpin in my time frame. You don't get to his level without first stepping on a whole lot of people before you could get to him. So if you've seen movies, and it's almost common knowledge, you could look at it on the internet anywhere. So this is not any form of confidential information or anything like that, but you need to kind of step your way up, or as in start from the lower guys, or the lower people that are operating within the organization, to be able to work your way up. So I had to step on a whole lot of people to be able to get to the kingpin. And if I could get to that kingpin, it would bring me a whole lot of accolade and a whole lot of that a boys or good job. And since my peers have now become my family, I mean, at times I even consider them closer than a brother, as in I did what I did turn my back and close my eyes to many things for the sake of the person who's standing next to me. Because again, we've established this camaraderie that is unbreakable. I was forced to put my life into their hands at times, and if we're going to do a raid, if the person that's on my side doesn't guard my right side when I'm going left, then I could be dead. So I had to put a level of trust in them, and so that meant that level of trust didn't change when we would do things that were not necessarily fully ethical. So going back to the corruption of the heart, uh, for me to be able to get promoted, which means financial gain, which means higher accolades, more self esteem, and more things for myself, I had to imprison as many people as I could. And that became self motivating, as in uh, my livelihood depended on me being able to bring good cases or arrest a lot of people. And so a lot of times to be able to get to where I wanted to go, the overall goal and what my supervisors were requiring of me, it required me to be able to do that. And so often we would, I guess, in the most raw sense, we would use people to be able to get to the next level, and at the expense of that person's life or those people's lives, to get to the next level. And what I mean by that is I guess, in the most clear sense, being DEA focused on drug interdiction and drug seizures and such, we would do small level buys, knowing that these are users and maybe small time drug dealers that the DEA is not interested in. And I wasn't really interested in that person in the sense of that's not the kingpin. He was a means to an end, and the end was the kingpin. But I have to think back to how many people I had to step on before I got to where I really wanted to go. And what was really the overall purpose was not so much because I felt that it's going to do the world a whole lot of good if that guy or if that the kingpin goes away, because we see now that that kingpin has gone away and I haven't seen any form of drug reduction
At all.
at all. Somebody else was very quickly ready to step into his shoes and make the more than $1 billion a year that he was making. But I had to think back as what was really my motivation behind that, and it was so that I could either be promoted, so that my peers, my brothers, can acknowledge me as a good investigator, or somebody that could walk in through the front door and I could have respect. So it became selfish in nature, and that's where I go back to the corruption of the heart. It was really looking at self. And so I feel I can't speak for others, but I could share about my personal experience in basically everybody that I worked around. And as a federal agency or as a federal agent, you share resources with other federal agencies. So I've worked alongside just about every federal agency there is out there, the whole acronym of them, the FBI, all the marshals, ICE, all the different federal agencies, as well as state and local agencies throughout the country, because our surveillance or our pursuit of major drug traffickers led me across country on more than many occasions, where we would start from the borders, the furthest southern point of the U.S. all the way to the furthest northeastern points. Drugs were often coming from the Mexico border in through the country and all the way up to either New York or Florida or many of our states in the East Coast. And so we would follow them. And along the way, we were in contact with many of the local and state officers. So I was able to connect with many of the different officers out there. And as soon as we would brief them on what we are doing there in their jurisdiction, we would give them a quick rundown on what's going on so that they have tactical awareness and that they're able to uh, deploy their teams if needed, because really needed the assistance of all of our local and state policing counterparts. Because as federal agents, we traveled in smaller groups, let's say anywhere from 5 to 10 agents, and we would really need the support of the local police. So as soon as we would brief them on the situation, it seems as if we just passed our hardened hearts off to them, or as in our perspective of those that were suspects in whatever investigation that we were conducting. So I've had the opportunity to hear the perspectives from so many different law enforcement agencies out there, and I don't want to paint the picture that law enforcement is corrupt in nature or are bad people in any which way. It's the job is difficult, and and you see the darkest of things. Your focus is the dark things of the world, and I truly feel that what you focus your time on and what you focus your life on, that becomes magnified. So I began to see
But
humanity.
it rubs off on you. You can't spend time in the dark, around dark, and not have some dark rub off on you.
And that's exactly to my point, as in, because I'm focusing on the dark things of the world, then I began to embrace darkness, and it really began to change my perspective on humanity and just on people. And so I began to look at people from a calloused heart, or it's as if everybody was doing wrong. And so I became very suspicious of basically everybody. Um, my personal weapon, or the gun that I carried with me, would never leave my side, because I felt that it's unsafe to walk out in the streets, which that is not necessarily the case. But it's because of the darkness, or the dark perspective, that I embraced, and so I began to see things in a very with a very dark perspective. And so, if you could just imagine that, now I'm walking in with this sense of dark perspective of humanity. So then, when we make contact with that person, that darkness, or my dark images of people, and I could say, then my darkened heart then reflects now on the person. And I feel that that's where the maltreatment, or the negative treatment towards our community, then is birthed out of there. It comes with that perspective, the initial contact with somebody. It's it's as if in my heart and mind I already had judged them as being evil or wrong or bad, and so it's almost as if I took out my perspective, my personal feelings and emotion on people.
There's just several things I want to touch on based on what you just said. But before I go into the darkness that really is up here, because I want to talk about the mental health and well-being of officers dealing and living in that darkness that they either acquired within the profession, or in cases like yours, you brought darkness with you, right? I've spoken to over 1,000 members of law enforcement, and I listen to officers of color talk about what they see, whether it's Walter Scott, or it's Tamir Rice, or it's Tyree Nichols. And they've shared in public forums that officers of color know better than to treat citizens who are white the way citizens of color are treated by law enforcement. They said, we know we can't do that. We might be able to do that to black and brown citizens, but we know that things will change overnight. Law enforcement reform would change overnight if officers of color were treating white American citizens the way all of law enforcement treats black and brown citizens. What do you say to that? Can you relate to that? Do you agree with that? Do you know where they're coming from when they say that?
Sure. So I'll speak very candid, and I'll talk to you about what I think about that. I feel that in that sense, the people of color, or the communities of color, are an easier target, and it goes along with what you're saying, that there would be an outrage, or it would hit the mainstream media if all of a sudden we saw people of or officers of color then now bringing injustice to white people. Uh,
You said Rodney King. Imagine 12 black officers beating a white man like that. That's what they're saying. This is what the officers are saying. They're saying that you will not see that.
right, and it seems like it's an unspoken. It's almost like a unspoken policy. It's based in our systemic biases. It's something that's unspoken, but it's just it's something that seems to be just known among the culture of blue, that these are things you don't want to do. The people of color will not be as easy to get representation or assistance from those that will be able to defend them. So it's kind of like an easier way to go. It's if you think about our natural animal instincts, the apex predators always go after the easier targets. Uh, where a lion may be considered at the top of the food chain, you won't see him going after a bear or another animal that might cause him harm back. So then he's going to look around and he's going to look at what is the easier prey for me to go after. And when you're given, I won't say quotas because I can't say that there was ever a quota given to me, but there was major pressure on making a difference by numbers. And so my job was to bring in those numbers, and so that my easiest prey was those that were the most vulnerable. Or if you want to look at it from just your basic animal instincts, um, because often we look to the vulnerable as in those who are not as uh, well versed in their rights, or as in immigrants, or those that are in fear of being deported. So we would constantly go after those that we knew would not say anything.
Low income, low education.
Marginalized communities is where we spent the majority of our time. And it's not to say, and research will show that uh, there's more crime in a low income marginalized community than there is in an affluent neighborhood. It's just there's more policing being done in these marginalized communities. So if you have 100 officers constantly policing a marginalized community and you only have 10 officers policing a affluent rich neighborhood, uh, obviously the numbers are going to be a lot higher in a marginalized community. And it was we knew that we wouldn't get as much um, conflict, or there was most of the people in the poor communities didn't have the type of education, the understanding, the know-how, the resources, the connections to decision makers, attorneys, and friends that could help them if we ever went into those communities and started to shake things up. That's common language that we heard, that I'll just share from my own personal experience that I heard. Let's go out there and mess with people, and and using different language. Let's go out there and mess with people. And so where would we go? To those areas that we knew that it was going to be easier to find, or not to find, but to shake things up, to go and perform knock and talks, as in knock on a door. And we know Fourth Amendment allows us the protection from government intrusion into homes. But we knew that by knocking on the doors of people who weren't educated in their Fourth Amendment rights would the majority of time let us in. I mean, I could probably count on one hand how many times I was denied access to somebody's home. Um, we would show up in force, or at least fully clothed for our own safety. But I consider that as in what must a person on the other side of the door think when you see um, somebody attired in military, clothing and weapons pointing at you and asking you if I could come inside and search your house.
And you knew you were violating their rights.
Yes, and I knew that it was somebody that probably didn't know their rights, or that was in fear
Exactly.
of our presence. And it was almost said jokingly, as in, "Oh, we're getting into this house, one way or another. We're getting into this house because I suspect something is going on inside." But we had no probable cause. There was no direct evidence. If we had evidence, then we would have the ability to get a warrant. But because we didn't have that evidence, we just had a hunch or a suspicion at time. We would go to the easier homes or the easier communities to be able to go and shake things up, and then that would give us the numbers that we needed, and we could go home and give each other high fives that we seized possibly drugs. I'm just wondering what would happen is if we went to the other side of the tracks and did the same. We'd probably get a lot more rejections, as in not allowing us to come in. It'd be people that were educated in
less success for you.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, and the way you frame it, Alfonso, is fascinating to me because based on the statistics and what you all are looking for, like drugs is low hanging fruit. And for me to be having this conversation with a member of law enforcement who spent so much time working for the DEA, for us to be talking about drugs, which is low hanging fruit, and so many people are incarcerated for possession, and you're talking about the easy prey, the uneducated, the socioeconomically disadvantaged, they don't know their rights, compared to, like you say, the other side of the tracks. And my definition, I want to share with you what my definition of the other side of the tracks is. One example, college campuses. All right. You're in a black or brown neighborhood, and a lot of the police activity, like you said, we're going to go and F with people. It really comes down to possession, right? Or if you're hustling out in the street and you're selling. There's so much more of an emphasis on law enforcement's part to be in those marginalized communities, searching for crimes of that nature, the low hanging fruit, the drug crimes, where there's just as much, if not taking place on a college campus, but the demographics are very different. And those kids on those college campuses could go about their illegal activity in peace until, and I'll say it, I'm a San Diego State alum. It's cyclical. Seems like every 5 years there's this huge drug bust at San Diego State where they recover X amount of hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars in name the drug. Well, what have you been doing all along? Allowing drug trafficking, drug possession, assault, sexual assault, rape, all that can take place unencumbered on a college campus, but not over here where Pookie and Ray Ray live. Talk to me about that, because it has to be a conscious, concerted effort to leave the college campuses alone and spend all our time in Long Beach or wherever.
Well, I have a direct example of that, something that I actually experienced coming out of the DA Academy and then going out into now my first field office, trying to come up with as many new ideas to be able to spark investigations, because you're not handed investigations. It's not reactive as in your typical law enforcement where you patrol a beat and you respond to whatever crimes are happening. Here you're kind of you begin your investigations really from scratch. So you really have to be thinking creatively. So in my thoughts as a young naive agent, I said I'm going to go over to Arizona State University, and I'm going to partner with the campus police there, which are sworn peace officers, thinking that they have a desire to rid their campuses of drugs and such. And I said, "Hi, I'm Alfonso. I'm here with the DEA, and I'd like to partner with you. We've arrested several people, and they've said that a lot of their drugs are coming from your campus, and so I'd like to partner with you. And we have the capability to expand investigations and do a whole lot of things that possibly your small campus police department cannot. Would you allow us, or would you at least call me when you get a hold of drugs?" And MDMA was big in those days, ecstasy, and that. Would you allow us to come in and partner with you? There was major headlines that made, the local news that week was somebody was cooking ecstasy in one of the college campus labs. So we knew that this was happening, and it was thought that there were more students in the chemistry labs. And so the response that I got back and really opened my eyes was, "No, thank you, agent. We don't need your help, nor do we really want to hear." And I couldn't understand that in the beginning. And the officer pulled me aside and he said, "I understand where you're coming from, and I would love to be able to use your resources and such, but to tell you the truth, they don't want to find the drugs here." And this came from one of the campus police officers. And he said, uh, "Parents from out of state will not be sending their sons and daughters to campus here if they continue to hear that there's a drug problem on our campus. So we'd rather just kind of keep it on the down low, not expose it too much." So if we bring DEA on campus, that's going to give us too much exposure. So, but aren't you worried about overdose and all the different things that come with
Yeah,
drug
what
abuse?
takes place when people are on drugs?
And I quickly learned that those are the areas that I should stay away from, and I should go back to where it's easier, the low hanging fruit. And so, sadly, that's where the
Which is
majority of our
neighborhoods of color.
yes.
So that is. Would you say that that's a universal issue inside of law enforcement? Because, you know, you point out Arizona State, I point out San Diego State. Ironically enough, when you go to the Barron's Guide, at least back in the day, those were the top two party schools in the country. Where those two were fighting for that distinction, right? But, you know, I'm a former college coach. I coached on 5 different campuses. All of those issues exist on all of those campuses across the country. And I'm hearing you say that there is kind of a gentleman's agreement, whether it's that's not really spoken, that DC Metro is staying off of Georgetown's campus, is staying off of American University's campus, is staying off of Catholic University's campus unless something extremely egregious happens after the fact. They're not doing any proactive policing on those campuses. Is that a problem inside of law enforcement?
I would say yes, and I'll give you an example that will provide evidence to what we're speaking of. But if we consider cocaine being cocaine hydrochloride, it's a substance that is a Schedule II substance, illegal, a felony. But cocaine and crack cocaine are derived from the same substance, the coca plant.
I know where you're going with this.
And cocaine being used highly by white Americans. I mean, the market is the reason why we have so much drugs coming in, because there's a market for it, and the market in the more affluent white communities, cocaine is being purchased at just staggering numbers. But then you have that same cocaine now being altered to make crack cocaine, which is basically just adding baking soda to it. Now it crystallizes or becomes a rock form, and then now it's sold in smaller quantities. It's
much cheaper
and easily distributed. But that's where the majority of focus went towards, as in we have this major epidemic, is what was portrayed and through our drug war and on every single media outlet out there, was that there's this epidemic of crack cocaine, but we don't look to the other communities where cocaine is still running wild. So exactly to your point, yes, we don't want to focus on those affluent communities and white communities that cocaine is readily available to anybody, but we will go after the crack cocaine that is being used in the marginalized communities, because it's easier to get to. Or not easier to get to. It's cheaper, and you don't need as much. And we see now the problem with the mass incarceration, and so many people are incarcerated behind the crack cocaine.
And the penal code. I mean, this all works hand in hand. I have to remind people constantly that law enforcement does not create the laws. Their job is to enforce the laws. But the difference in penalty, and I remember President Obama talking about this out in the open. He was the first president to ever talk about it out in the open. The penalty for being caught with crack cocaine compared to powdered cocaine was 100 times more severe than powder cocaine. And I can't remember the exact phrase. I think he might have called it the 100 to 1 ratio. I can't remember.
It's 5 grams. So 5 grams of crack cocaine gives you the same penalty or same time in jail than what a kilogram of cocaine would be. So if you find a kilogram, which is 2.2 pounds.
So if you find a kilo of coke compared to 5 grams,
it gives you the same under the sentencing guidelines.
So a kilogram is how much?
2.2 pounds.
2.2 pounds. 5 grams. That's like a grain of salt compared to a mountain.
That's right. So if I was to cut open a kilo of cocaine, it would be a small mountain here before, something that
Right.
you would see on Scarface or
And
something
you
like
would
that.
take that
And
much.
I could take a pinch out of the kilogram and place it to the side and say, disproportionate amounts. But that equates with the disproportionate amounts of people of color that are now serving prison time based on those 5 grams compared to the kilo of cocaine.
So
And in the federal system, it's the minimum. There's a minimum mandatory sentence, meaning there is no parole behind it. It's a mandatory life sentence of 10 years. So you will serve those 10 years.
is that still the case?
They've recently the law has changed because of I believe it came under President Obama's time in office, that it was looked at as in that is the sentencing laws were completely unjust, and even there were still remaining persons that were in jail or doing time in prison that were able to now get resentenced based on the new laws. So that has changed since, and that's something that's been helpful.
So I want to make sure that we cover this particular topic of mental health and well-being inside of law enforcement. And, over the years, that topic keeps coming up to the point where I personally feel and professionally feel that mental health is some low-hanging fruit where community residents and law enforcement could actually discover quite a bit of common ground as it relates to, we agree here that something needs to be done, and we are all for working with you to fix this issue, because mental health and well-being is such a pervasive problem in our greater society that we have ignored for many years how big an issue it has been inside of the law enforcement community. So you talk to me about a callous heart. You talk to me about the darkness, heart, mind, darkness of the profession, dealing with dark issues, dealing with dark people. Talk to me about the mental health challenges inside of law enforcement and what is and isn't being done to address that issue.
Sure, a very big issue and very true what you're saying. And I'll first speak anecdotally from my own perspective. I came from the military, as we've covered throughout this conversation, knowing that I had my own personal mental health challenges, as in I had learned how to live what I consider to be the normal life with holding on to trauma. I was able to go directly into law enforcement without that ever being really looked at.
In an official capacity.
In an official capacity. I was given a psychological test, but I was well versed and understood mental health. I knew what to say and how to get through it. So there was nothing that revealed any type of mental health problem. So I went directly into law enforcement, coming out of a very traumatic time in my previous 8 years. So I carried what I was holding on to in the military, and I carried it directly into law enforcement.
On the federal level.
On a federal level. And so that the psychological exam was the only thing that was ever examined, and that was a written test. So as long as I was able to answer the questions correctly, I was able to move on in my application process. So I began my career in law enforcement, and I began to experience even more trauma. And I won't say necessarily this is also true, but I'll even give more context to the trauma of what I'm speaking about in trauma. Anytime there's a prolonged sense of time that your adrenaline continues, if, for example, I'll go back to the military because it might be easier to understand, but let's say you're deployed to a foreign country and there's explosions going off around you, or at least within the vicinity that you could hear them, smell the gunpowder, smell the fire burning and such. When you're first there, every bomb that goes off, you jump and you're scared, and maybe you might take some shelter. After some time and some months that go by, it just becomes second nature, and it's almost as if now you're just uh, as if it's a normal part of life. But your adrenaline is still going. It's the way that our natural way our body responds to anything that could be dangerous. Our bodies are just greatly created in which it tries to protect us from harm, and so we get this burst, or this just a burst of adrenaline that is there to help you. It's the fight or flight syndrome. It's either you freeze, or you run and fight, but it's that extra chemical release of that hormonal chemical that's giving you that extra strength to be able to do what you need to do to stay alive. There's been examples of mothers, lifting up cars if their child is caught up underneath because of this adrenaline rush. But anytime somebody's left with long periods of time of adrenaline, then it can become brain damaging, and it can also lead um, to trauma that is now uh, will remain inside of the brain, and that's what we consider to be uh, that leading to post-traumatic stress. Anytime you're in a traumatic situation and you don't necessarily want to deal with it because you still have responsibilities to get through, so you really just begin to isolate, or segregate those feelings and emotions, the fears that you're actually experiencing, because they're real life fears. And you just put them back in the backside of your brain. It's really just trauma's caught within the amygdala of the brain, and it's not processing that situation. Well, having that inside of my brain, and knowing that was there, I moved into a successful career into law enforcement and began really thriving in my career, but that had not been handled. And like I said, the only examination I ever had was a written test that proved that I was psychologically fit to continue my career now in law enforcement. And so I did. Uh, but basically, on every operation that we would go out to, my adrenaline would go up as high as it could go. And I began to get used to this adrenaline rush. And it almost became a necessity. It almost became like an addiction. And so you may have heard of adrenaline junkies that go and risk their lives and bungee jump and do all these extreme sports in in pursuit of that adrenaline rush. Well, in law enforcement, it could be that way as well. And so many law enforcement officers get into this career path because they know that it could be a career that could be rewarding or exciting, because it is one that will inspire that adrenaline to be released into to the body. And if you're one that's an adrenaline junkie, or one that that feels comfortable functioning with high levels of adrenaline, then it's a great career for you, because you could be sitting somewhere and all of a sudden you get a call and there's 211 in progress. Your heart starts pounding. You hit the gas as hard as you can and you go, and your adrenaline's pumping. So when you show up to the scene, that adrenaline's still going, and that adrenaline is meant to be able to help you fight your way out of this problem, or at least to give you the strength to be able to survive. And so prolonged periods of time of this adrenaline then it could become very damaging to the brain. And continuing to function with that type of brain damage then can cause people to react in ways that a regular person would normally not react. You may become very impulsive. You may be very quick to anger. You may not be able to control or regulate your emotions in the way that you would normally do it, or another person may normally be able to handle their emotions. So you could see how somebody gets a call to respond to a domestic violence. Their heart is pumping. They want to stay alive, just like everybody does. And all of a sudden, you're triggered by the violence that is happening. Or if in the case of, let's say, Breonna Taylor, um, where the raid that was botched and just handled incorrectly. But I put myself in the shoes of those officers showing up on that scene, and they crash the door and a gunshot goes off. Well, their adrenaline is now going through the roof, so they're ready to respond according to many of the past situations that they've experienced, or many of that, or much of that trauma that you've been carrying for so long. So if I put myself in those shoes, and I feel that many law enforcement officers came from many different experiences that I have. Many law enforcement officers come in from the military. There's a
About
large
a quarter of
percentage,
them. Yeah.
and as well as in the federal side, many federal agents come from a former law enforcement experience. So they're carrying untreated trauma. So you show up and a gunshot goes off immediately. If I was speaking from that situation, I would revert to my training in the Marine Corps. With my mission, or my rule of engagement, was to acquire, target, seek, and destroy at whatever means necessary. And so I could understand the officer. There was an officer, there was several officers, but one officer began to fire into the window, unknowing who was behind those curtains.
The wall,
He
actually.
began to fire through what was not. He was not positive what was on the other side.
Right,
That's a military tactic, because you acquire target. You know that your target is anybody that opposes you in military tactics. And so he began to fire, and it kind of, when I said that I was watching the news, and it kind of triggered me, because that's the type of action, the tactical response that we would take towards, if my brothers under my race of blue are being targeted or being attacked because of the fear that Kent Williams had when somebody crashed at his door, and all of a sudden now he feels his life is in danger, so he responds by trying to protect himself and his girlfriend Brianna. Now on the officer's end, they hear a gunshot, and they know, I believe that they knew that one of their officers had been hit. They're going to respond with over 30 rounds or whatever they calculated to be, but it was excessive. But it's not excessive under the mentality of a traumatic state that you may already be bringing with you. If we removed police officers and we put a team of people that had never been under previous traumatic experiences, they may have handled it with the tactics that they have been trained, because normally police officers are very well strategized, and they have a clear-cut plan for most scenarios, and they practice and train over and over in situations on how to do raids and search warrants, and how to do it safely, number one, for their team, and safely for those that you are suspecting of committing crimes. It seemed that the response was excessive, but I could understand it if they were coming in with trauma from their personal past situations. So that speaks to the mental health side, as in being in law enforcement. It was unspoken no, as in do not go see the psych doctor, because they'll take away your gun, and you'll get put in some form of administrative position if you're ever considered to be unfit psychologically, mentally. So it was an unspoken rule that everybody knew, and I actually heard it verbally from several people. They said, when you go see the shrink or the psych doctor, don't tell them really how you feel, because they'll take away your gun, and that almost feels like a loss of identity. If I am well trained and my duty is to carry my weapon in support of my brotherhood, or my family and my race of blue, and now I'm sitting at a desk, it's as if I let my family down. And I experienced this personally on several occasions. At one point, I was many situations. I was held at gunpoint and kidnapped and bagged and beaten.
This was in the military.
No, this was in the law
DEA.
enforcement.
Okay,
in the DEA,
okay.
I was acting in an undercover capacity. At this one example out of the many, but I'll share this one. I was acting as the drug dealer, and law enforcement can do that. We could lie, and we can portray whatever it is that we need to portray to be able to bring some of our suspects, or to further our case. And so I was acting as a drug dealer. This specific situation turned into a drug rip, as in those that were coming to buy the drugs that I was in an undercover capacity alleging to be selling. Rather than wanting to buy them, they chose to rip me, or to steal them from me. So they held me at gunpoint, and they hit me several times with their shotgun. They jumped into the vehicle that I was driving, that was loaded with actual drugs inside of it, and it was a high speed chase. And in the meanwhile, I was bagged with, I think it was a black pillowcase with a shotgun to my head, and I couldn't find a way out of it, I really started to.
Nick, you're gonna die.
I thought that I was going to die, and so I quickly remembered that I had a relationship with God at one point, and I called out to Him, and I said, God, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I think I'm going to die today. And I could hear I, I was able to slightly see through the pillowcase, and I could see the person who's holding the shotgun to my head. His finger was on the trigger, and that means that I'm just a millimeter away from it going off, and and the vehicle's in motion, so just a bump could trigger that shotgun to go off. So I had really faced my reality that I was going to die here. They all the people inside of the vehicle began to panic, and they started to look out the windows, and I took that time to jump out of the window, out of the moving vehicle. And, I was slightly hurt, scraped up and such, but I was able to get out of that situation. And the high-speed chase turned into a big wreck. The van that the suspects were driving full of drugs went over the side of an embankment, and there was drugs all over the city. And they got them. But at the end of that, my supervisor came and talked to me a little bit and said, "How do you feel? How are you doing?" I said, "I'm great. I'm fine. And, my adrenaline's pumping, but I'm good. I'm used to this type of activity, and I'm okay." Being that we arrested those persons that were suspects, we quickly interrogated them, and they let us know the next part to it, the ones that had actually hired them to rip us off. So they were really just like a mob squad. They were really just the crew that was supposed to rip us off. And I wanted back in the game immediately, and that is kind of surprising now as I think about it. But here I am, 1 millimeter away from death, and rather than going to to safety, my boss said, "You don't have to go out there. You just went through this." And I was cut up, and I had road rash everywhere. And I said, "No, I want to get back in this game. Don't take me out. I want to jump back in." And so I'm like, "Please don't take me out. I'm the undercover here. They still believe that I'm good. Send me in that house with the real guys that formulated this plan, and let me talk to them. That way we can get them as well." So that ended. At the next day, I came into the office, and they said, "We're going to send you to see the psychologist, and so you could talk to them." And he kind of gave me like a wink, as in, "But you know what that means, right?" As if whatever you disclose, however you're feeling, that's going to determine what is going to happen with you. And so I quickly learned that I needed to keep my mouth shut. And so I went and I talked to the psychologist, and I said, "Oh, I'm fine. I've processed this information. Everything's okay. I'm good. I don't feel I'm in any danger, and I feel like I could still perform my duties according to what I'm supposed to." How I'm supposed to perform. And so I went on about my work. There was no counseling from there.
They just took your word for it. And there was nothing embedded in the system to protect you from yourself and protect the community from you. See, that's the other piece of the mental health dilemma inside of law enforcement. There is no system of checks and balances here in the state of California. You have to take that long form psychiatric evaluation anytime you enter into an agency. But if you stay in that agency for 25 years, you've only had to take it once, right?
That's correct.
You only have to take it a second time if you change agencies. So I'm listening to you talk. I'm listening to some of the things that you have experienced. Otherworldly trauma that most of us will never experience in our lives. And that was in the federal government, that experience. And you took all of those experiences and whatever you were carrying with you psychologically into local law enforcement. And you could be a danger to yourself. The number one cause of death amongst law enforcement is suicide. So you are a danger to yourself. But if you're a danger to yourself and you're not your best mental self, how is that adding to the health of the community? If our government is sending thousands of members of law enforcement into communities that have been traumatized on their own and traumatized due to their experience with law enforcement, everybody's bringing their trauma to the table together, but y'all have the guns and are authorized to use them. And then you have the police unions and our elected officials signing contracts that allow for all of this. Do you see any remedies to this situation? What have you thought about throughout the course of your life when you look back on your time in law enforcement? What do you think we can be doing to address this mental health issue that exists inside of law enforcement?
So definitely very truthful everything that you're saying, and that the mental health side needs to be addressed. Uh, from my personal experience, all of these mental health traumas and the weight that I had been carrying for so long then began to now manifest itself on the outside of me. So it really began to hurt my family life, and I began to find ways to cope. And again, that came through alcohol, because that seemed to be what was readily available to me, and seemed socially normal to drink to the point of blackout. That way I didn't have to have the bad dreams that I was experiencing mostly every night. Then I ended up getting a divorce with my high school sweetheart during that time, and it really began to impact my family. And now here I am alone and isolated because we did divorce and we separated. And so now I'm sitting alone, but going out to do my job every day. And so that just that supports what you're saying, because who I was now out in the community was a person that was really going through some hurt and really had some bottled up pain inside, but I had nobody to talk to because my peers were either going through the same thing, and it was just something that we knew to just kind of keep inside. So
So you could keep your job.
so you could keep your job really, and to not be looked down upon. There's a huge stigma inside of the culture, and it began to affect my personal life. And so now here I am alone, and so it just began to get worse. And it seemed like my personal life and who I was, I really began to um, lose hope and my control. And so I began to work more to really get my mind off of what was going on in my personal life. And we know that in law enforcement and military, it's a little higher than 50% divorce rate and suicide. I mean, I could even say that I came to that point where I felt at times not even sure where it was coming from, but I just felt this guilt and shame and a world of hurt inside of me, and I didn't know where I could go because of the stigma. I didn't feel that I could go to a therapist or anybody that would be able to help me with myself. And so it came to a point to where just things were going wrong. I'll just share one quick story. At one night, I heard a noise in my. I had a walk-in closet. I heard a noise in there, and I assumed that it was somebody that had broken in or somebody that was after me based on my career path. And so I had my weapon close to me, and so I went into the closet to try to figure out what it was, and I fired a couple rounds at what I thought was something moving. I fired a couple rounds at it, and the next day I found out I nicked my gas line by a centimeter. I nicked it, and the next day I went to go look around everywhere because it smelled like rotten eggs,
Yeah, you
but
could
it
have
was the
died.
gas. I
Yeah,
could have died instantly, but taken out the whole neighborhood as
right.
well. But that's when I really got this kind of fear of God again, as in, what am I doing? And is this the right thing for me? Now to bring it back to what can be done inside of law enforcement and the culture of law enforcement, because I don't feel that I'm alone on this. And because I now in my current state and my current ambitions as I am now a clinical therapist, and I actually counsel many members of law enforcement as well as veterans and the incarcerated, basically, and those that are facing some of the most severe trauma. So
Beautiful.
I'm able to hear what their personal experiences are, and they're not very far off from mine, just in different scenarios. Um, One would be to remove the stigma that is ingrained in the culture of law enforcement, the stigma that it's not okay to ask for help, that uh, if it could be brought in from the top down, as in starting either from the police chief or the supervisors that are overseeing the field officers, the ones who are really out there, because you could lose touch when you get into supervisory positions. You could lose touch with the reality of the trauma that is really experienced by law enforcement on a day-to-day basis.
How about this state, Alfonso? You say top down. How about it starting at the state level? The
Yes,
AG.
at the highest level of authority that would begin to bring in a new culture, or a culture that supports mental health care and services and therapy and um, clinical care for those that do face trauma on a consistent basis. And I'm not even speaking again on the individual events that law enforcement officers face, but there's a form of a residual or vicarious trauma that could be given, as in if your partner experiences trauma, that same trauma could be passed on to you vicariously
Right.
through those that you're dealing with and those that you're around. And so many officers will never get into a gun shootout, but their heightened levels of adrenaline remain high, and that in itself is traumatic over periods of time. So removing the stigma in some way, it's not a something that could just be removed like a turning on a light switch, but it's something that could be if we begin to flood the culture of law enforcement and traumatic agencies that are functioning in high levels of trauma, that it's the best practice and that it's actually required to engage in clinical therapy and help for yourself, then you could then be the best you for the community and return to the original purpose of protecting and serving. So that would be the beginning, I would say, to bring mental health into the culture, as in removing those stigmas, as in offering those resources, as in having trained therapists and clinicians that may be able to relate best to law enforcement, to provide those resources where somebody that is out there in the field, working in the field and experiencing trauma, that they could easily go to, and it won't be something that is looked at as in you're betraying your peers, or as in you're not going to lose your job over it, as in but you're getting the necessary care you need. If there was an officer that had all of a sudden a physical disease or a physical problem, they would not nobody would hesitate to go and see a doctor to get physically help,
Well,
sometimes physical help,
well,
but
there's some debate
mentally.
to that. Yeah. Men don't like going to the doctor, but I understand. I understand what you're saying. There's no stigma to that, right? And if you have to sit out for a period of time, there's no stigma to that. If you have to retire, a lot of officers have had to retire because they were shot in the hip and they just can't do the job anymore. There's no stigma to that, and that's accepted. It's not accepted for you to no longer be in the profession because you don't have the psychological or mental capacity to do the job anymore. It's not that you're crazy. It's just that some people have reached a point where it's not safe for you or the community for you to be in the community every day with a gun and a license to use it.
That's exactly right. And I mentioned that walking around with this type of trauma and mental health challenges, and just this perspective that the world is negative or evil, or you become very cynical of the communities. Walking out with that type of perspective because of what we've allowed ourselves to believe, and so therapy could also help in that sense, as in not allowing our hearts or our minds to become so cynical over others, so that when somebody is first on scene, they're not showing up with a cynical mind and immediately wanting to go to to a comply or I'll hurt you stance, but that the first responder that shows up to any scene shows up with the mentality and the perspective that I'm here to protect them, and to protect the public and to serve in whichever way that I can. So, making mental health services accessible, making it to where it's something that's a positive rather than a negative, and also having mental health providers out there in the communities as well that are like, we're seeing a lot of changes to that where we'll have mental health clinicians out there with law enforcement. That's a great beginning, but unless the perspective of an officer receiving those mental health services, one will not be open to possibly offering those services. One won't see ever the importance of mental health if one doesn't even believe in it in itself. And I could say I didn't feel that mental health care was necessary for me while I was there, because it was so
You were in too deep.
ingrained
Right,
into me,
exactly.
yeah, that if I went to go see a mental health professional, that it would be a negative thing, and that I would be looked at as negatively, as in somebody who can't hold their own or who's unstable. So if that stigma is removed and if it's supported by those that are the decision makers and those that are in supervisory positions, then law enforcement would then possibly be able to see from a different lens and see that mental health services are so necessary for the community as well as for themselves.
I know our time is waning, Alfonso, but I want to ask you this: with what you're doing now and being a therapist, what do you hear most from members of law enforcement when they're talking to you about their issues? What are some of the top topics of conversation that they bring to you regarding like what's going on inside of them?
Really, the foundation of where all of their symptoms are coming from, and just like myself, but what I hear most when we get to the root of what their symptoms are, it lies in their guilt and shame of where how they perceive themselves. Um, Living out a career where treating people either in an unjust manner or perceiving people as in consistently negative brings them shame and sense of guilt. And so they feel trapped. They feel as if there's confusion. They don't see a way out. There's some fear, a loss of hope. And so these are some of the symptoms, but it's really rooted to the deeper parts of what really lies deepest within them, and what lied deepest within me was the sense of guilt, as in we're created to love others because we're created from a fully loving Father. And when we can't express and give out what we were created for is to love others, and we are actually doing the opposite, as in looking at other people with a sense of hate or bitterness or resentment, um, then we're not living out our full purpose. And even though we're functioning properly within our careers, because I had all the accolades and all the awards to show that I did my job very well, inside of me, I was in chaos, and there was a constant storm going on inside of me. When I really was able to open up and be vulnerable before, somebody that was able to counsel me through therapy, I realized that it was the core of the emotions that I was experiencing was shame and guilt for how I had allowed myself to really perceive humanity, and it was the ability to be now vulnerable and really express my thoughts and process all those things that I had held deep within inside of myself. To get that out was a world of freedom for me, and now I can't really stop being vulnerable, and even that's why I'm here now, because if it'll help anybody else, and I really pray that this conversation here is not looked at as if it's my attack or if I have some form of vendetta or resentment in any way towards our law enforcement members, because they're really great people that I believe came in with the intent to do well. But over the period of their career, they somehow lost that ambition and that original intent to go out and to serve and to protect others, which is unselfish.
The culture did that though.
The culture did that, and somewhere in there you lose that initial intent, that initial desire and ambition, and really what we were called to do. As the heart becomes callous, then you really just roll with the culture, and the culture is very tough, and it's one that's um, looking at protecting oneself, and then, as I mentioned before, then it begins to look out more for self than it is for others, because really the mission or the purpose of law enforcement again is to be selfless. And there are many, many heroes out there who have given their lives in pursuit of protecting their communities. Uh, but that sense of uh, ambition then begins to become cynical and calloused with what you consistently begin to believe about self and about the community. So then you're now operating in a protective mode, as in the community's against me, and they become our enemies. Almost now relating that back to my military experience, where functioning in the military, I had an enemy, and that enemy I never knew. It was the enemy that the government told me was my enemy, and I just functioned and operated according to what my job was, and my job was to take out that enemy who they said was my enemy. If I had met the person on the other side, I probably would have not considered him an enemy. I would have considered he's just a person, just like I'm a person. And in law enforcement, we could tend to get that same type of perspective, as in the communities can become our enemy because of the continuous negative, dark sides of what we see on an individual basis. But I bring that back to, I feel that law enforcement can find a way out, and that's why I'm actually here to share that to bring hope to anybody that finds themselves in that situation where they're feeling that form of shame or guilt based on the way that they've allowed themselves to perceive humanity and the communities. And I'm one that's been able to find my way now in life with where I could say I'm fully free of any shame and guilt. I've returned to my roots of knowing that I'm absolutely loved by God. And now I'm able to then love others as the way that He's called me to love. And so, and part of my experience now, I volunteer inside of the prisons. It is very surprising to even me that I was once the guy who was incarcerating people at the fastest rate to gain more success and notoriety for myself, and now I'm the guy who's inside of the prisons on a voluntary basis, and nobody really knows that I'm in there because I don't do it for any self-recognition. I don't get paid. I go in there and volunteer my time inside of the prisons, inside of the county jails, inside of the juvenile halls, and I also have a nonprofit where I'm able to help those who have experienced any form of detention, any form of massive amounts of trauma while you're incarcerated is very traumatic. So those that are re-entering into our communities and society now, I'm there with open arms to say that there is hope, and that there is an opportunity for you to return to our communities fully healthy and healed. But that's going to take some vulnerability, some acknowledgement of what you've been through. And so that's where I spend most of my time now is dealing with those who've been through traumatic experiences, and I'm able to use my personal experiences and my education as well, because I'm a licensed clinician and I've been through the education to be able to do that. The number one reason was to first allow myself to be healed. I needed to find healing in all of my personal experiences, and now that I am fully healed, and then I'm now giving back, and I'm willing to talk to and accept really anybody. And also, I'm an educator, so I'm able to teach practices that are more efficient in law enforcement and community policing and such.
Is it a nonprofit organization?
So it's a nonprofit that I opened up some time ago.
What's the name of it?
Redemption Ladders, and we really stand on being there for anybody that has barriers from becoming the best person they could be. And one of the things that we were doing was removing tattoos that were a barrier to becoming the best you. As in, it's hard to find employment, housing, relationships, stigma, just negative. Being looked at negatively because of some prison-based tattoos or gang-related or anything that's a barrier. A tattoo could on their face or anywhere that's visible that causes the person to have low self-esteem or feel insecure based on the life that they lived. And if they want to live now free and become whatever their goals lead them to become, then we would remove those tattoos for absolutely free. But not just that, it's not just a service. That's really just the what helps us bring them in the door. But really, we then embrace them as a community and just really begin to teach them and train them and love them and show them that they are not what they were actually told or what they've believed about themselves. And so we know that when we begin to believe different about ourselves, when our mind is allowed to be renewed and changed from our past patterns, um, then we could become the better us. And so that's kind of a summary of our really of our nonprofit and what we do.
What's your web address?
It's redemptionladders.com.
Are you on Instagram or
No,
YouTube?
well, COVID put us to a halt for now. So right now we're kind of at a pause state, but there's a lot more coming, and it will be thriving here very soon. There's a lot more that goes to that, and we could maybe even talk about that at another point. But that nonprofit is kind of now branching out into where we're going to be able to provide everything that I just explained, minus the laser tattoo removal stuff, but through virtual reality. So we're now looking to be able to provide headsets, and through a virtual reality platform, we're going to be able to provide those headsets to all the incarcerated, or as many as the incarcerated that are wanting to receive or be a part of this community, where they'll be able to be a part of a community in this virtual world. So it's kind of like the metaverse, but it's the megaverse.
I get it.
And so that's up and coming, and that'll be a part of our newest direction that we're going with this nonprofit. But really, it's all for the purpose of finding those that are incarcerated, those that are going through trauma, and that are reentering into our communities.
Well, Alfonso, I want to thank you for sharing your personal story and your perspective on law enforcement, on trauma, on mental health, on a great number of things. Incredible story, incredible human being, brother. Thank you for joining us. I want to have you back here at some point.
Thank you very much for having me. It's just been a pleasure.